So death and dying, that comes under the health area of our project. And I'm working on this with quite a number of people, actually, although recently it's been um, narrowed to Zach Monroe, and I have really been staying focused and trying to work through some things, particularly on the Death Cafes project, which has been our priority. But we started out by meeting with quite a wide range of people and consulting with people. Especially some of our collaborators have a lot of experience thinking about death and dying. Paul Bramadat, um, uh, Cheryl Reimer Kirkham has experience with this. And so we consulted widely. Margit Warburg will be involved eventually because she's interested in funerals. And so we have a fairly broad range. We consulted with palliative care, nurses. We consulted with people who facilitate death cafes. We consulted with people in the so-called death industry. And we developed a series of projects. The one where we are still at design phase, but we're starting to put together our ethics application. And the one that I'll talk a little bit more about today is the Death Cafes piece. This is sort of our program for the next few years, and we will hopefully get to all of these before the end of the project. But for the moment, Death Cafes. So what are the narratives of death and dying in death cafes? And for those of you who don't know, death cafes were in-person activities where people get together to talk about death, but not from a religious standpoint. Or they can speak from a religious standpoint, but they are not supposed to proselytize or attempt to push any one worldview. So there's certainly religious language that comes, but the idea is this is a forum in which people can talk about death. Ideally, people aren't in the grieving process, but it's simply a way to have a conversation. So we've targeted death cafes as a way to ask some questions about religious, non-religious, religious ways of conceptualizing and responding to death. Some of our objectives are just simply and you can simply read them. I don't have to read them out to you. I'm also aware of time, and we'd really like to have time for conversations. So how are we doing this? Website analysis. Death cafes are often reported on a website that sort of centralizes, when facilitators do a death cafe, they'll put a little write-up on about the death cafe. And so we're looking at that website. We will eventually do facilitator or key informant interviews with those who facilitate death cafes. One of the things that's clear on the death cafe, with the death cafe rules, is that researchers are not allowed to be at death cafes to actually do research. So we can't do participant observation. But what we decided we could do was to solicit or seek information from key informants and do interviews with them, and then develop a series of focus groups with participants that might in some way mirror what happens in the death cafe experience. So asking participants about what they get from the death cafe, how it helps them to think about death, and so on. And then we may do separate interviews with participants depending on where we find ourselves after the focus groups. It's not clear to us at this point how useful that will be, but again, we're in early days, and so we'll work toward that, and keeping that in mind as one possible method. Another project that I mentioned is on obituaries and funerals. So we'd like to examine obituaries to track shifts in language, donation patterns. So it used to be that you might see, please donate to the church of whatever, and now you might see, please donate to the SPCA, and so on. So we're interested in those, and we're aware that there is already a body of research on that. We're interested too in life rituals and how end-of-life rituals and how they change. And sometimes we see that reflected in write-ups about a particular person's death. And then how do the non-religious articulate grief and produce new grieving rituals? And again, there is a bit of a literature on this. So we're trying not to replicate work that's already been done, but think about new questions and things that have yet to be explored. This is where Margaret comes in because she's interested in forest funerals. So we'll have further conversation on that and develop that project in collaboration with her. Cultural representations of death, film, music, literature, podcasts, social media, gaming events, and organizations. How are themes of death and dying represented in relation to religion, non-religion? How do productions of representations constitute practices of non-religion? And how do different mediums shape representations of non-religion and turn inform its substantive qualities? So the cultural representations piece of it, we essentially have thought about it, but there's no mobilization of this into an actual research design at this point. And it's the same with the obituaries project. That's in very fledgling stages. But we do know that we want to head down this road. I've been watching episodes of 6 Feet Under as my contribution to thinking about cultural representations. And that, again, that's more for my amusement and entertainment and to help me think through this project than anything else. But I expect there's something there that will happen eventually. National narratives. What are the national narratives of dying, and in what ways are they religious or non-religious? El Dia de Muertes in Argentina and its new non-religious forms was something that Juan Marco raised with us. And so while Zach and I are working on this, we've also consulted with other co-investigators, Doug Ezzi and Juan Marco Vagioni in particular, and Ryan Cragen has also contributed, and we'll pull them back in as we move through these projects. And then finally, how does the media frame death through the COVID-19 pandemic? Here's our COVID-19 piece, which has been perplexing me, thinking about we need to do something on COVID-19. And I've just sort of sat back and thought about that. And we've done a little bit in law on the COVID-19 as well with one of the law students who worked with us this winter. Those projects around COVID-19 haven't been fully articulated yet. We have quite a bit on the go already. And so we're letting the dust kind of settle a bit on COVID-19, and then we'll come back to that. Medical assistance in dying, MAID, as we call it in Canada. What does this reveal about religion and non-religion? What are the discourses of suffering? How do they link to religion and non-religion? And how do MAID providers conceptualize their work? And Corey Steele and I have worked a bit on this through the Carter decision in the Supreme Court of Canada, and Corey has done his master's work on some of that, thinking about shifting language and the ways in which the law has started to shift toward a human rights discussion rather than a validation and valorization of suffering, which we saw in earlier Supreme Court decisions. In particular, I've been interested in the way that the Supreme Court has reconceptualized sanctity of life, taking it away from a religious framework and largely a religious right framework, and to place it more fully in a supportive way in relation to medical assistance in dying, which is legal in Canada, for those of you who don't know that. Palliative care, a long time ago, a couple of palliative care nurses told me that they felt that there was not a clear enough sense of how to care for non-religious people who were dying. And so I felt that we needed to do something on palliative care. Again, some of the team members have expertise on this, and we have not really got to this place yet. But this is a project that I think will help us to think about religion, non-religion, again, in new ways. And perhaps like the Law Project will tell us a little bit in terms of the social actors involved, will tell us a little bit about that line or that social construction of religion and non-religion. So that is all for death and dying, run through rather quickly, just so in the interest of time, and hoping that we can perhaps have time for conversation.